The invitation card said nothing special about the humans. It listed them somewhere near the bottom, between the Mulvari Collective and the Shreth Wanderers, two civilizations so small that most delegates forgot they existed by the second day of any summit. Nobody at the Vorthan Station Diplomatic Registry had done this on purpose. That was simply where humanity fell when you sorted by fleet size, territorial reach, and galactic age, near the bottom, almost at the end. Vorthan Station sat in the high orbit of Drovan 9, a gas giant so large that its storms alone were wider than most inner-system planets. The station itself had been built by 6 different civilizations over 400 years, and it showed. Some corridors were tall enough for the Groven, who stood 9 feet and never ducked for anything. Other corridors were sealed behind pressure doors that only the aquatic Cellon could pass through comfortably. The central hall, where the Interstellar Accord Summit took place every 30 years, was the one space large enough for nearly everyone. It smelled of recycled air and old ambition. Ships had been arriving for 3 days before the summit opened. The Vreth Dominion came first, as they always did, because arriving first was a statement. Their vessels were the color of deep volcanic rock, long and ridged, and they entered the docking ring without requesting permission because the Vreth did not request anything. They announced. 2 elder dragons disembarked alongside a retinue of smaller attendants, and the whole docking bay went quiet the way spaces go quiet when something very large and very old walks into them. Sovereign Dravath led the Vreth delegation. He was 11,000 years old, which among his kind made him middle-aged, though among nearly every other species at the summit it made him older than most of their recorded histories. He was the color of charred bone and moved with the slowness of something that had stopped being afraid of time. Behind him, smaller by half, but watching everything with enormous pale eyes, came his daughter Lissa. She was only 90 years old. By Vreth reckoning, she was practically an infant. Dravath had brought her so she could see how the lesser civilizations behaved when they were trying to appear important. The Mulvari arrived with a light show. The Cordani came with a choir that sang their names for 40 minutes. The Belthari sent 3 warships as an escort, even though weapons were not permitted inside Vorthan's docking perimeter, and the station's defense systems had to formally remind them of this twice. Every civilization that walked through those docking bays seemed to understand that arriving at a summit was itself a kind of performance, and they had all prepared for it. The human ship arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. It was a single vessel, mid-sized, with no escort. It docked in Bay 17 without fanfare, without a choir, without any communication to the station beyond the standard arrival code. 12 people walked off it. They wore plain dark suits, carried their own bags, and the tallest among them was perhaps 5 feet 11. They moved through the docking corridor toward the registration desk, and most of the delegates who saw them assumed they were maintenance staff. Ren Holt was the 7th person off the ship. He was in his late 40s, with grey beginning to show at his temples and a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors once before spending a lot of time in meeting rooms. He carried a worn leather satchel that had a small repair sewn along one strap. He was not the head of the human delegation. That was Director Ulma Voss, a sharp woman in her 60s who walked directly to the registration desk and handled the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times in smaller rooms. Ren was an attaché. He handled details. He was the kind of person who knew which rooms had good acoustics and which hallways the important delegates walked through when they wanted to avoid being seen. He noticed the Vreth delegation immediately because it was difficult not to. Dravath stood in the central corridor outside the registration area speaking with one of the station's senior officials, and the sound of his voice was like something geological. Ren watched him for a moment, then looked at the young dragonling standing 3 steps behind the sovereign, studying the ceiling panels with great interest. The opening reception was that evening. Every delegation was expected to attend, stand in their assigned area, and allow the station's protocol officers to conduct the formal introductions. It was ceremonial and slow and had been done the same way for 200 years because the Accord believed that boredom was neutral territory. Dravath waited until the human delegation was formally introduced. The protocol officer said the words. A handful of delegates nodded. Dravath said nothing during the introduction itself, but afterward, in the open space near the refreshment stations where conversations were not official and therefore not recorded, he spoke loudly enough that 24 delegates could hear him. He said that it was admirable, in a way, that a species so recently arrived to space travel continued to attend these summits. He said it with the tone of a man complimenting a child for trying to carry something too heavy. He noted that humanity measured its history in centuries rather than millennia. He observed that Earth was, by any meaningful measure, a wet rock in an unremarkable system, and that the human presence at the Accord was a courtesy extended by older civilizations who found it more comfortable to include everyone than to explain the exclusions. Several delegates laughed. A few looked away. Director Voss kept her expression perfectly still. Wren was not standing with the delegation when this happened. He had already drifted toward a quieter part of the hall, and he heard the speech from a distance, the way you hear something unpleasant happening in another room. He did not go back. He found a seat near one of the corridor archways and opened his satchel and took out a small block of dark wood and a short-handled carving knife. He had been working on it for 2 weeks already, during the travel time between Earth and the station. It was going to be a dragon if his hands kept agreeing with his intentions. He had barely made 4 cuts when he noticed that someone was watching him. He looked up. The pale-eyed dragonling was standing at the edge of the corridor, half in shadow, staring at the block of wood in his hands with the pure, uncomplicated attention that very young creatures give to things they have never seen before. Wren set the knife carefully on his knee and did not say anything yet. He waited to see if she would come closer or run away. She did neither for a long moment. Then she took 1 step forward, and then another, and then she was standing close enough that he could see the faint pattern of scales along her jaw that had not quite finished growing in. He said hello. She said nothing. She was looking at the wood. He held it out so she could see it better. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. Then she looked back at the wood. He could see the question forming, the kind of question that does not yet have words because the person asking it has never needed to ask anything like it before. He turned the block slowly in his hands so she could see it from every angle. He said it was not much yet. He said it was going to take a while. She watched his hands. He made 1 more cut, a shallow curve along what would eventually be the line of a wing. A thin curl of wood fell to the floor. She watched it fall. She crouched down and picked it up and held it between 2 small claws and looked at it as if it was something very serious. Somewhere back in the reception hall, her father was still talking. Out here in the corridor, there was only the sound of a knife on wood, and a young dragon holding a wood shaving up to the light, turning it slowly, trying to understand what kind of creature made things this way. Wood shavings do not mean anything to a dragon. They are plant matter, broken down, lightweight, something that disintegrates if you breathe on it wrong. Lissa knew this. She had grown up in a palace made of volcanic stone that had been shaped by her grandfather's fire over 6 generations. Everything in her world was made of things that lasted. Stone, metal, the deep-hardened resin of creature shells, things that took heat and pressure to break. She had held things that weighed more than the entire human ship sitting in Bay 17, and she had not found them impressive because weight was not impressive when you were a dragon. Weight was just a number. But she kept the wood shaving. She was not entirely sure why. She had put it inside the small carry pouch she wore on a strap across her chest, which contained the 3 things she was allowed to bring to the summit: a seal stone with her family's mark, a folded document of Vreth genealogy that her father made her carry everywhere as a reminder of what she came from, and now a thin curl of pale wood from a block being slowly shaped by a human's hands. The next morning, she went looking for him. This was not difficult. Vorthan Station was large, but the delegate areas were mapped, and the humans had been assigned a cluster of rooms on the 14th residential corridor, which was the same corridor as the Mulvari and the Shreth, because that was where the smaller delegations went. Lissa walked there by herself, which was also not difficult because nobody paid much attention to where a dragonling wandered as long as she stayed out of the formal halls. She found him in the same way she had found him the night before, by following the sound of something she did not recognize. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, not the sound of construction, not the sound of any tool she knew. It was coming from a small, open sitting area at the end of the corridor where a bench faced a window that looked out at the planet below. Ren Holt was sitting on the bench. The block of wood was in his left hand and the knife was in his right, and he was working with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was also thinking about something else entirely. A small pile of shavings had gathered on the bench beside him. He did not look up when she approached, but she had the impression that he had noticed her anyway. She sat down on the floor near the bench because the bench was human-sized and would not hold her. She looked at the wood. More of it had been removed since the night before. There was a shape beginning to appear from the block, something that had a head and a long neck and the suggestion of folded wings, though all of it was still rough and approximate. She asked him what it would look like when it was done. He thought about this for a moment, turning the block in his hand. He said it would look like a dragon, or at least like his idea of one, and that his idea was based on old drawings and stories from his home world, so it might not look very much like her at all. He said this without apology. He seemed comfortable with the possibility of being inaccurate. She asked him why he was making it. He said he carved things when he needed to think. He said his hands worked better when they were busy, and that having something to hold helped him understand what he was trying to work out in his head. He said he had been carrying this block for 2 weeks and had been working through how to approach the summit, who to talk to, what the smaller delegations actually needed as opposed to what the agenda said they needed. She found this confusing. She asked if the carving helped him think about politics. He said it was more that the carving kept him patient. He said patience was the thing he needed most at summits like this one. She thought about this. She looked at the wood again. She asked if she could watch him work. He said yes without making a thing of it. He just went back to carving. She sat on the floor by the bench and watched. He did not perform for her. He did not go faster or make dramatic cuts. He just worked, shaving small amounts of material away with careful strokes, turning the block, examining it, working some more. Sometimes he stopped and looked out at the storms of Drovan 9 for a while before continuing. She asked him questions when she thought of them. He answered all of them. She asked why he used that particular kind of knife. He said it was the right size for the kind of detail he wanted. She asked how long it would take. He said a few more evenings, probably. She asked if he had made things like this before. He said yes, for most of his life, starting when he was very young and his father showed him how. She asked what his father made. He said mostly small animals, birds mostly, though once a very good fish that was still sitting on a shelf in his childhood home somewhere in the north of his country on Earth. She asked what Earth was like. He described it for a few minutes. The oceans, the way the sky changed color at different times of day, the fact that weather on Earth was not controlled or managed, and sometimes it simply rained on you when you had not expected it. He described a specific kind of morning in autumn when the air was cold and the light was low and the whole world felt like it was pausing before something happened, and he said that was the feeling he liked best. She had never heard anyone describe a planet the way he described Earth. The Vreth described Gravos in terms of its age, its volcanic activity, its military significance, its place in the Dominion's history. They did not describe what the mornings felt like. She was in the middle of thinking about this when she heard her father's footsteps. Draveth moved the way large things move through spaces not built for them, not awkwardly, but with the certainty that everything else would adjust. He came around the corner of the corridor and stopped when he saw Lissa sitting on the floor beside the human's bench. His expression did not change much, but Lissa had known her father's face for 90 years, and she could read what the small changes meant. He looked at her, then at Ren, then at the wood in Ren's hands. He looked at it for several seconds with the particular attention he gave to things he found beneath consideration, but was deciding how to address. Then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh in the way that small creatures are mean. It was the laugh of someone who has seen a great deal and finds this particular thing illustrative of a point they have been making for a long time. It was a confirming laugh. He said that he had heard humans were creative, in their way, the way that birds were creative when they built nests. He said the carving looked very little like a real dragon. He said the wings were disproportionate, and the neck was too thick, and the whole thing had the quality of something made by a creature that had only ever seen dragons from a very great distance. He said all of this in the calm, educational tone he used when he was teaching Lissa something, as if Ren were a lesson rather than a person. Ren had stopped carving when Draveth arrived. He was holding the block in both hands and listening to the sovereign with the same expression he had worn when Draveth spoke at the reception the night before. Calm, present, not hurt and not pretending not to be hurt, simply steady in a way that Lissa did not entirely understand. When Draveth finished, there was a short silence. Ren said, "It is not finished yet." That was all he said. Draveth held his gaze for a moment and then looked at Lissa and told her it was time to come. She stood up. She followed her father back down the corridor. She did not look back, but she heard the soft scraping of the knife resume before she turned the corner. She went to bed that night thinking about what he had said. It is not finished yet. She was not sure if he was talking about the carving. She did not find the small wooden dragon outside their quarters until the next morning, when she almost stepped on it. It was sitting on the floor just outside the door, as if someone had set it down gently and then walked away without waiting to see if anyone would find it. She picked it up. It was finished now. The wings were still not proportionate, and the neck was still a little thick, but there was something in it, something in the way the head was angled slightly downward, as if looking at something small on the ground below it, that made it feel less like a carving and more like a creature that had been caught in a moment. She held it for a long time. Then she put it in her carry pouch, next to the seal stone and the genealogy document, and went inside to prepare for the day. There is a specific kind of listening that most people never learn. It is not the listening you do while you wait for your turn to speak. It is not the listening you do when you are trying to find the flaw in what someone is saying. It is the kind where you go quiet inside and let the other person's words arrive in full, without interruption, without the noise of your own thoughts running ahead of them. It is rare. Most diplomats do not have it. Most politicians do not have it. Most people who spend their lives being important in rooms full of other important people have long since lost it, if they ever had it. Ren Holt had it. He had spent the first 2 days of the summit in rooms that nobody else had bothered to visit. The Accord's formal agenda covered the major disputes, the Haven Corridor territorial question, the tariff restructuring across the Belthari trade lanes, the renewal of the station-neutral zone agreements. These things would be decided in the main hall loudly by the delegations with the largest ships and the longest histories. Everyone knew this. The small delegations attended because attendance was required, and because occasionally someone threw them a minor concession to make the votes look cleaner. Ren was not in the main hall during those first 2 days. He was in a narrow meeting room off the 9th level corridor where the Shreth Wanderers had been placed because their environmental needs required a slightly higher humidity than most other areas of the station. He was in the Mulvari Collective's 4-chair meeting space, drinking something warm that the Mulvari had offered him and which tasted approximately like salted grass, but which he consumed without complaint because it was the thing they had offered. He was in a corridor outside the Fen delegation's quarters because the Fen did not like enclosed meeting spaces, talking with their eldest speaker for an hour and a half while both of them stood near a window. He was asking questions, not about the agenda, about them, about their systems, their roots, their particular problems, about what they had been told and what they had not been told, and what they had quietly accepted as unchangeable because no one with any power had ever seemed interested in changing it. The Fen, it turned out, were very interested in talking to someone who asked questions and then waited for the answers. By the third evening, Ren had filled one notebook and started a second. Director Voss asked him what he had found. He sat with her for 2 hours and walked her through everything, the patterns, the older agreements, the one specific piece of information that had made him pause and go back and ask 3 more questions to make sure he had understood it correctly. The Haven Corridor had been a disputed territory for 40 years. The Vreth wanted it because of its position relative to their border systems. The Cordani wanted it for the heavy mineral deposits in its outer belt. The Belthari wanted it primarily because the Vreth wanted it, and denying the Vreth things had been Belthari foreign policy for 200 years. None of these three could agree, which was why the Accord Summit had the Haven question on its agenda for the fourth time in 60 years. What nobody had examined closely were the transit records from before the territorial dispute began. The Fen had been navigating the Haven Corridor for 300 years before anyone else declared it worth arguing about. So had the Shreth Wanderers, and the Mulvari Collective had 6 generations of map trade routes through 3 of the corridor's central systems. Under Accord law, the original charter, not the revised version the major powers had pushed through 80 years ago, but the original, which the revisions had not fully superseded, because the supersession clause had itself been contested and never formally resolved, established navigation rights held by a recognized Accord member civilization could not be unilaterally extinguished by a territorial claim. They could be bought. They could be negotiated away. They could not simply be declared irrelevant. None of the 3 major powers had noticed this, because none of them had spent any time with the Fen or the Mulvari or the Shreth. Those delegations did not have ships worth counting. Their votes at the Accord were politely acknowledged and immediately discounted. Their histories were not considered significant enough to research. Voss looked at Ren for a long time after he finished explaining. She said, "Can we prove it?" He put 3 notebooks and a folder of copied historical records on the table. She said, "All right." The 4th day of the summit was when the Haven Corridor question was scheduled for formal floor debate. Dravath arrived in the main hall with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already decided how the day will end. The Cordani delegation filled an entire section of the hall. The Belthari had sent 4 representatives, each of whom looked like they had been specifically bred for confrontational eye contact. The humans sat near the back, in the area assigned to smaller delegations. The debate proceeded as expected for the first 90 minutes. The Vreth spoke of historical precedent and border security. The Cordani spoke of economic necessity and shared resource development. The Belthari spoke of balance and subtly implied that Vreth dominance in the region would destabilize the entire sector. The smaller delegations listened and said nothing because there was nothing they were expected to say. Then Director Voss asked for the floor. There was a brief, confused pause. The Accord's protocol required that floor requests be honored in order, and Voss had submitted hers properly and on time, so the session chair granted it, though with the slight hesitation of someone trying to remember which delegation that was. Voss stood. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She laid out, in order, the navigational history of the Fen, the Shreth, and the Mulvari Collective in the Haven Corridor, the relevant provisions of the original Accord Charter, and the legal determination that followed. She then stated that under those provisions, any territorial resolution of the Haven question required the consent of those 3 civilizations, which meant the consent of 9 votes at the current session, which meant that no solution acceptable only to the major powers could be passed. She sat down. The hall was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than it should have been. Dravath turned slowly in his seat and looked at the back of the room where the human delegation was sitting. His expression was not readable in the way most expressions are readable. It was the face of someone doing arithmetic on a problem they had not expected to encounter. The session chair asked the Fen, Shreth, and Mulvari delegations to confirm the navigational claims. All 3 confirmed them immediately in the clear, slightly surprised voices of people who had not previously understood that their histories were relevant. The debate that followed lasted the rest of the day and ran into the evening. The major powers could not simply override the legal obstacle. They tried to argue that the original charter clause did not apply to territorial disputes, only to transit taxation. Ren, sitting quietly in the back row, had already written the counter-argument to this interpretation in the margin of his second notebook 2 nights earlier. Voss delivered it. They tried to argue that the Mulvari route maps were outdated. Ren had the Mulvari's current navigator present a real-time confirmation that the routes were active. Every door they tried was already addressed. By the end of the evening, the major powers were negotiating with the smaller delegations instead of ignoring them. The Fen wanted guaranteed transit rights, in writing, for the next century. The Shreth wanted 3 systems protected from extraction activity. The Mulvari wanted access to the mineral markets they had been informally excluded from for 40 years. The final agreement gave humans favorable trade access to 3 Haven systems in exchange for Ren's coordination work. It was not what the Vreth had wanted, the Cordani had wanted, or the Belthari had wanted. It was, according to the Accord's own legal framework, the only solution that was actually valid. Dravath left the hall after the vote without speaking to anyone. His delegation followed him. His face, as he passed the back row where the human delegation sat, gave nothing away. Ren watched him go. He was not smiling. He did not feel the need to. He was already thinking about the debrief, the documentation, the 3 follow-up conversations he needed to have before the Fen delegation departed tomorrow. His satchel was open on the seat beside him. The 2 completed notebooks were inside it, along with his carving knife and a new block of wood he had picked up from the station's small market on level 3. He had not decided yet what he was going to make from it. He thought he might start on the journey home. 60 years is not a long time if you are made of the right material. Volcanic basalt, for example, does not notice 60 years. The deep ocean floors do not notice. The stars around which Vorthan's station orbited did not notice, because stars measure their lives in billions, and 60 years does not even register as a breath. Sovereign Dravath did not particularly notice either, in the way that you do not particularly notice an afternoon passing when you have lived 11,000 of them. He grew older. His scales deepened in color, going from charred bone to something closer to ash. His council meetings ran a little longer because the younger Vreth needed more explanation for things he found obvious. He won some border agreements, lost a minor trade negotiation near the Cordani edge, and continued to refer to humanity when they came up in conversation as clever vermin who would plateau eventually. Lissa, on the other hand, noticed every one of those 60 years. She was 150 now, which was still young for a Vreth, but she was no longer the dragonling who had sat on a corridor floor watching wood shavings fall. She had grown into her full wingspan. Her scales had set into their permanent color, a deep green-gray like old copper left in rain. She commanded a small fleet. She had her own council advisors, her own set of diplomatic contacts, and her own way of approaching problems that her father found occasionally useful and frequently irritating. She still had the wooden dragon. It lived in a specific place in her quarters, a shallow stone ledge that held 3 other things she considered important, and the carved wooden figure sat at the end of that row, worn smooth along its wings from decades of being picked up and put down and carried in her hand when she was thinking. The proportions were still not right. The neck was still too thick. None of that had bothered her in 60 years. The world outside was not standing still, while Lissa grew and Dravath aged, and the wooden dragon slowly became smoother. Humanity had been busy. This was not the kind of busy that was easy to see from any particular direction. There were no dramatic territorial expansions, no fleets moving into unclaimed systems with weapons hot. There was no moment that anyone could point to and say, that was when the humans became significant. It happened more the way water moves through stone, not by force, but by persistence, by finding the low places and filling them, and then finding the next low places and filling those. Human ships began appearing in systems where other ships did not bother to go. Small systems, disputed systems where nobody could agree on ownership, and so everyone had quietly agreed to ignore them. Systems with only one habitable world, one small population, one set of problems that the Accord's major powers considered too minor to address. In those places, human survey vessels turned up. Human engineers turned up. Human mediators turned up with notebooks and the specific, unhurried kind of attention that Ren Holt had carried into every corridor of Vorthan's station 40 years ago. and which, it turned out, was not a personal quality of Ren Holtz, but a general quality of humans who chose this kind of work. They fixed things, not dramatically, quietly. A water processing system on a small world near the Fen border that had been failing for 20 years was repaired by a 4-person human technical team who stayed for 3 months, trained the locals, and left documentation in the local language. A trade dispute between 2 minor civilizations in the outer Kordani region that had been simmering for 60 years was resolved by a human mediator who had no stake in either side and who spent 4 months talking to both of them before writing a 30-page proposal that both sides accepted, because it was the first proposal that demonstrated someone had actually listened to both of them equally. None of this made headlines. The Accord's major news channels covered the Vreth border disputes and the Kordani economic summits and the Belthari arms negotiations because those were the things that involved large ships and loud voices. The quiet work humanity was doing in the margins was not the kind of thing that generated headlines. It generated trust, which is a different thing, and which takes longer to build, and which is worth considerably more when you finally need to spend it. In Dravath's council chambers, when humanity came up, which was not often, because Dravath had spent 60 years being proven right that humans were not worth watching, the assessment remained the same. Clever vermin, a minor presence, skilled at the kind of small negotiations that the great civilizations found beneath their time, good at making themselves seem useful without ever becoming important. Lissa sat in those council meetings and said nothing most of the time. She had learned in 60 years that there was a particular category of thing that her father would never be persuaded of directly, and that the correct approach to those things was to not try. She watched. She kept her own notes. She had her own way of counting. In her counting, humanity had established working relationships with 43 civilizations that the Vreth Dominion had never formally acknowledged. They had functional presence in 61 systems the Dominion had written off as strategically unimportant. They had resolved, quietly, 17 disputes in the past 30 years that had the potential to create instability in regions adjacent to Vreth space, not because they were protecting Vreth interests, but simply because they were there and they were paying attention, and instability in their neighbors was something they preferred to address before it spread. She thought about this in the way she thought about the wooden dragon, about something made from what looked like nothing, by someone who did not seem to be doing very much, adding up over time into something that was genuinely hard to replace. The crisis came in the 43rd year after the summit. It did not announce itself as a crisis at first, because serious things rarely do. It came as a report from a Vreth border observation station near the Haven Corridor, a cluster of systems populated by several small civilizations with silicon-based biology, a biological profile the Vreth shared almost nothing with. The report noted an unusual die-off in one of those systems, an anomalous pathogen, silicon biology specific. The observation station's recommendation was to flag it for monitoring and revisit in 90 days. The flag was entered. No follow-up action was taken because follow-up action for a disease in a silicon biology population was not a Vreth priority. Silicon biology civilizations were, in the Dominion's formal strategic assessment, a Category 3 consideration, which meant acknowledged, not threatened, and not worth significant resource deployment. By the time anyone looked at the monitoring data again, the pathogen had spread to 4 systems. The die-off in the first system had gone from anomalous to catastrophic. 3 of the 4 affected civilizations were sending distress communications to any Accord member that would accept them. Dravath's council met to discuss the situation. The consensus was that the Vreth were not affected. The Vreth were not going to be affected given the biological difference, and that deploying Dominion resources to assist silicon biology populations in non-Vreth systems was not justifiable. The matter was referred to the General Accord channels, where it would sit in a queue behind 17 other pending action requests. Lissa sat in that council meeting and said nothing. She went back to her quarters. She looked at the wooden dragon on the stone ledge for a long time. Then she sat down at her communication station. She pulled up the Accord diplomatic directory. She went to the section for the Human Unified Delegation, and she composed a message, which was not something she had ever done before, and which she spent a long time writing, because she was not entirely sure what she was asking for or whether anyone on the other end would know who she was. She wrote that she was Lissa of the Vreth Dominion, daughter of Sovereign Dravath. She wrote that she was contacting the human delegation regarding an unaddressed biological crisis in the systems adjacent to Vreth-controlled space. She wrote the details, the pathogen, the affected systems, the number of estimated casualties if the current rate continued. She wrote that the Vreth Dominion would not be deploying resources to this situation, but that she believed someone should. She did not sign it with her title, she signed it with her name. She sent it and then sat very still, not certain what she expected. The response arrived in less than a day. It was not from a department or an office. It was from a person, a short message, direct, using her name without her title, which was either an oversight or a deliberate choice, and she suspected it was the latter. The message said that the Human Unified Delegation had received her communication and was treating it as urgent. It said that a medical research vessel in the region, a ship called the Steady Hand, could be redirected within 48 hours. It said that the delegation was grateful for her notification. At the bottom, there was a line that said, "We remember the Vorthon summit. That work still matters to us. We are glad you reached out." She read that last line twice. Then she folded the message away and went to prepare for the argument she was going to have with her father. It was, as she had expected, a considerable argument. But she had also expected to survive it, and she did. The Steady Hand was not an impressive ship, by any measure, that the Vreth Dominion used to evaluate ships. It was a mid-sized research and medical vessel, roughly half the length of the smallest Vreth patrol craft. It had no weapons systems. Its hull showed the small dents and repair patches that accumulate on a working ship that spends most of its time in systems without proper maintenance facilities. It traveled at a speed that a Vreth warship would have found embarrassing. When it came out of transit near the first affected system, it did so quietly, without the kind of energy signature that announced arrival the way the Dominion's ships announced arrival. Lissa's command ship was already in the region. She had positioned it there 3 days before the Steady Hand arrived, telling her fleet captain that she was monitoring the situation on behalf of the Dominion, which was technically accurate and technically not authorized, but which nobody in her chain of command had formally objected to yet, because Dravath was still composing his formal objection, and his formal objections were long documents that took time to finalize. She watched the Steady Hand drop out of transit on her display screen. It was a small mark on the map, moving carefully between the system's outer marker beacons, broadcasting its medical clearance codes. She sent a docking authorization, and they accepted it and came alongside. Then she suited to pressure and went to meet them herself rather than sending an attendant, because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it without pretending it was something other than what it was. The airlock opened, 5 humans came through. The one in front was a woman in her early 40s, with short dark hair and the kind of posture that comes from spending years on ships where you had to stay balanced in uncertain gravity. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Wayland. She said she was the lead xenobiologist. She shook Lissa's hand, which was a gesture Lissa had read about but not experienced, and which felt more natural than she had expected. Sarah's team was already moving. 2 of them were unloading equipment cases from the transfer trolley before the introductions were finished. One of them, a young man with a tablet who had barely glanced up, was asking Lissa's attending officer for access to the monitoring data the Vreth observation station had collected. He was not rude about it. He just clearly believed that the fastest path from introduction to results was to skip the middle as much as possible. Lissa watched them and said nothing for a moment. She had seen delegations arrive before. She had seen the Vreth's own scientific corps deployed to situations that required expertise. There was a particular way that important specialists arrived in difficult situations, a certain amount of preamble, a certain establishment of authority, a certain amount of time spent making clear what resources would be needed and what guarantees would be required before work began. Sierra's team did not do any of that. They arrived and they started. The equipment cases were open on the floor of Lissa's hangar bay within 10 minutes. Sierra was already talking through a communication line with someone on the steady hand, asking for the secondary sample processing unit to be brought over because she wanted to run the initial cultures on the ship rather than in the bay if possible. The young man with the tablet had located the monitoring data and was already telling the person next to him which numbers looked wrong. Lissa asked Sierra how long it would take to understand what they were dealing with. Sierra looked up briefly from the sample case she was organizing and said she would know more in 24 hours, and she would tell Lissa exactly what she knew at that point, including what she did not know, because the things she did not know were usually the most important ones to identify quickly. Then she went back to the sample case. The next 4 weeks were the closest thing to a sustained demonstration that Lissa had ever witnessed. She did not have a better word for it than that. The Steady Hands team worked in a rhythm that seemed simple from the outside and which she gradually understood was not simple at all, but was the product of so much repetition and trust between specific people that it had become smooth. Sierra and her team argued with each other constantly, but the arguments were always about the problem, not about each other, and they ended not when one person won, but when someone said something that made everyone else stop and think, and then start working in a new direction. They slept in short rotations. Sierra went to sleep for 5 hours and came back, and someone else went to sleep while she reviewed what had been learned while she was resting. They ate at their workstations. One of the team members kept a running log that was updated every 2 hours with every finding, every dead end, every tentative conclusion marked with a confidence percentage so nobody would mistake a guess for a certainty. On the 6th day, Lissa received a formal communication from Gravos, her father. It was long. She read it once, set it aside, and went back to watching the humans work. Dravoth's position was clear. Lissa had deployed her fleet section to an unsanctioned mission. She had invited a foreign species medical team into Vreth-adjacent space without authorization. She had, in his view, demonstrated that she did not understand what the Dominion's interests were and why they were worth protecting. He wanted her to withdraw to the Vreth border immediately. He was suspending her fleet authorization pending a formal review. He was, the message made clear at some length, deeply disappointed. Lissa wrote back a short reply. She said she had read his message. She said she was staying. She was not certain what this decision was going to cost her, and she decided it was not useful to think about that right now. On the 14th day, Sierra came to find Lissa rather than waiting for their scheduled briefing. She found her standing near the observation window that looked out at the first affected world, a dry, rust-colored planet whose population had been dropping the quarantine updates every 6 hours. Sierra sat down on a crate nearby and said she thought she had something. Not a cure, she said. She was careful about that. She said it was more of an interruption, a synthesized compound that would slow the pathogen's replication rate significantly in silicon biology hosts, which would buy time for the affected species' own immune responses to adapt and develop resistance. It was not elegant. It required production at scale, and it needed to be administered in a specific way that was going to be complicated in some of the more remote settlements. But it was real, and she was confident enough in it to begin production immediately. She said all of this in the same tone she used when she was not yet certain, level, specific, careful. She told Lissa exactly what the compound would and would not do, the realistic timeline, the risks of the production process, the things that could still go wrong. She did not make it sound better than it was. She also did not hedge past the point of usefulness. Lissa asked her what she needed to make it work. Sierra said she needed access to 3 production facilities in the affected systems and a Vreth authorization code to move equipment through the border checkpoints. Lissa said she would get it. She was not entirely certain she had the standing to get it, given the formal suspension, but she sent the requests and wrote them in terms of humanitarian obligation and existing Accord framework rather than Dominion policy. And after 36 hours, the border station administrators cleared them without escalating to Dravoth's council, because nobody wanted to be the administrator who delayed a plague response. The compound went into production. 4 weeks after the steady hand had arrived, the spread rate in the first 3 systems had dropped below the critical threshold. The 4th system was harder. The pathogen had taken hold more deeply, but by the end of the 5th week, it too was beginning to turn. The steady hand prepared to leave. They had been in the region for 6 weeks, and their next scheduled mission was already 2 weeks overdue. Sierra's team packed their equipment with the same efficiency they had used to unpack it, and there was not much ceremony about it. Which Lissa was beginning to understand was a human quality and not indifference. Before they departed, Lissa asked Sierra to come to her quarters for a short time. Sierra came. She stood in the doorway first, the way someone stands when they are not sure if they are supposed to come inside, and Lissa gestured her in. The quarters were large, as befitted her rank, with the stone ledge along one wall that held her few significant objects. Lissa reached out and picked up the wooden dragon. She held it in both hands for a moment, then held it out so Sierra could see it properly. Sierra looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Her expression changed in a way that was not easy to describe. It became more careful somehow, like someone looking at something they wanted to see clearly. Lissa said this was made by a man called Ren Holt. At the Vorthon summit 60 years ago, my father mocked it. He left it for me without waiting to see if I would find it. I have carried it since I was 90 years old. I want you to know that because I think you should know what he left behind. Sierra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ren Holt was my grandfather's mentor. She said she had heard his Vorthon stories growing up, the whole summit, the notebooks, the Haven corridor vote. She said she had never known about the carving. Nobody had. He had not mentioned it. Lissa said he made it look like nothing. She said it quietly, as if she was saying it to herself as much as to Sierra. That is the part my father never understood. He thought nothing was nothing. Ren knew that nothing was just where you started. Sierra looked at the wooden dragon for another long moment. Then she looked at Lissa. She said that sounded right. She said she thought that was probably what her grandfather's mentor would have said if he had been the kind of person to say things like that, which he was not. They stood there for a moment in the shared quiet of people who understood each other without needing to extend it further. Then Sierra said she should get back to her ship. She had a report to file and a very overdue appointment with a meal that was not eaten at a workstation. Lissa said, "Thank you." Sierra said, "Thank you for the message. We needed to know." She left. The steady hand departed within the hour. Lissa stood at the observation window and watched it go until it was too small to see, and then she went back to her communication station because she had 3 things to write, and none of them were going to be comfortable, and she had learned from watching the humans that discomfort was not a reason to wait. Dravath died on a winter morning on Gravos, in the deep stone chamber he had slept in for 4,000 years, with the volcanic vents running warm through the floor and the sound of his household guards moving quietly in the outer hall. He was not ill. He was simply done, in the way that very old things sometimes simply become done, the way a fire burns all the way through its fuel and goes out without drama. He had outlasted most of the things he had hated and most of the things he had loved, and a great many things he had simply considered irrelevant, and he went without a final speech, which surprised some of the people who knew him and surprised none of the people who knew him well. He was not a small life. That was the complicated thing about Dravath, and Lissa sat with it for a long time after he was gone. He had been enormous and wrong about important things and right about others, and he had loved her in the particular way that very proud creatures love their children, which is to say partially and conditionally, but also genuinely, in whatever space was left over from loving themselves. She was not glad he was dead. She was also not going to pretend that certain conversations had become easier. She was 230 now. Among her people, this was the age at which you stopped being considered young in any context. Her wings were fully set. Her council had stopped treating her positions as the positions of someone who still had development to do and started treating them as simply her positions, to be engaged with on their own terms. After Dravath died, there was a period of formal succession deliberation that lasted 8 months and was deeply tedious and ended where most people expected it to end, which was with Lissa leading the Vreth Dominion's Council of Elders. She did not change everything. That was not what she was doing, and anyone who expected dramatic reversals did not know her well. She changed the things that needed changing at the speed that kept the changes from breaking what did not need to be broken, and she kept the things that were still true. The Dominion was real. Its history was real. Its obligations to its own people were real. None of that was what she was questioning. What she was questioning, had been questioning for 140 years, was the specific habit of deciding in advance what was worth noticing, and then simply not noticing anything that fell outside that decision. Her father had been a supreme example of this habit. He had decided what mattered, and he had been consistent about it for 11,000 years, and the consistency was genuinely impressive, and it had also meant that a mid-rank human attaché had once outmaneuvered the entire Vreth Dominion at a summit using nothing but notebooks and conversations with small delegations that Dravath had not considered worth having. She drafted the proposal herself, over 2 months, writing and revising and setting it aside and coming back to it with fresh eyes. It was not a short document. It covered the legal framework for the diplomatic exchange, the parameters of the joint research program, the specific protections around Vreth's sovereign authority that she needed to include to get it past the Council's more traditional members. It included a historical preamble that began at the Vorthan Summit 60 years before Lissa was born and traced the line from that summit to the Haven Corridor resolution to the Silicon Biology pathogen response, and through 23 other moments where human presence in the margins had made a direct difference to outcomes in or near Vreth space. She sent it to the Human Unified Delegation 3 months before she brought it to her own council. She wanted them to read it first. She wanted them to have time to understand what she was proposing and to believe that she was serious. She received a response within a week, a long one, careful, with specific proposed amendments in 4 sections, all of which were reasonable, 2 of which were genuinely better than her original language. She accepted all 4. The agreement that emerged was formally called the Vreth Human Cooperative Framework. In the Accord records, it was listed under that name. In the internal human delegation documents, from the first day it was signed, it was called the Holt Compact. Lissa learned this approximately 6 months after the signing, through a contact in the Accord Secretariat. She held that information quietly for several days. She did not know whether to find it too sentimental or exactly right, and eventually she decided it was exactly right, because sentiment was not the point, and she suspected the humans knew it was not the point either. They named it that because they remembered where things started, and remembering where things started was, in her experience, a practice that humans took seriously in a way that many other civilizations did not. The signing ceremony was held on Vorthan Station, which Lissa had requested specifically, at a session of the Accord that was otherwise routine. The station's protocol office had prepared a formal ceremony with a hall arrangement and a 2-hour agenda. She had reduced it to 40 minutes because the things that were true did not need 2 hours to be true. Her advisors had prepared a speech. It was good. It covered the long history of the Vreth Dominion, the significance of the framework, the meaning of the occasion in the context of the Accord's broader evolution. It used the phrase unprecedented partnership 3 times and the phrase new era twice. She had read it twice, thanked the person who wrote it, and set it aside. She stood at the signing table with the representatives of the human delegation, not Sierra Wayland, who had retired from active service 5 years earlier, but a younger woman who had the same quality of directness, and she said what she wanted to say, which was shorter than the prepared speech and more accurate. She told the gathered delegates about a corridor on the 14th residential level of Vorthan Station, 100 years before this moment. She described a man sitting on a bench with a block of wood and a short knife. She described the sound she had followed to find him. She said that at the time she had not understood what she was seeing, and that her father had not understood it either, though the 2 of them had not understood it in very different ways. She said her father had seen a primitive thing being made by a limited creature. She said she had seen something new and had not had the words for it at 90 years old and had spent the next 140 years slowly finding them. She said that the man was making something that did not already exist, not because he had to, not because anyone had asked him to, not because there was a strategy behind it or a reward at the end. He was making it because he was the kind of creature that made things, and because there was a small dragon watching him, and because a small dragon watching him was enough reason to make something worth watching. She said that her father had seen this as evidence of humanity's limitations. She had eventually understood it as evidence of something else entirely, that the willingness to make something real for someone who could offer you nothing, no alliance, no resource, no political advantage, just attention and curiosity, was not a limitation. It was a kind of strength that did not look like strength from the outside, and which was therefore very easy to discount, and which was also the reason the Vreth Dominion had spent 100 years benefiting from human presence without ever formally acknowledging it. She said she was formally acknowledging it now. She signed the document, the human delegation signed it, the Accords Session Chair countersigned as witness. Afterward, when the formal portion was done and the delegates were moving into the adjacent hall for refreshments, Lissa stayed at the signing table for a moment. She reached into the carry pouch. She still wore a different one than the one from 100 years ago, but the same style, because she had never stopped wearing one, and she set the wooden dragon on the table. It was very small on the wide formal table. It was worn nearly smooth now, the detail of the wings and the angled head still visible, but softened by 140 years of being held. It looked like exactly what it was, a simple thing made by hand by someone who had not expected it to matter. A sound beside her. She looked down. A young dragonling, perhaps 30 years old, from the attendant staff, someone's child, brought along the way Lissa herself had been brought along a very long time ago, was standing at the edge of the table, staring at the carving with the particular intensity that young creatures have when they encounter something they cannot immediately classify. Lissa picked up the wooden dragon and held it at a height where the dragonling could see it properly. The dragonling asked what it was. Lissa said, "A dragon, a human made it." The dragonling looked at it for a long time. Then she asked why it looked so simple. Lissa was quiet for a moment. She turned the carving once in her hand. She said, "Because the person who made it understood that the thing does not have to be impressive. It just has to be real." The dragonling reached out one small claw. Lissa let her take it. She held it carefully with both hands, the way small creatures hold things they sense are important without knowing why. Somewhere in a human archive on Earth, in the records of the Unified Delegation's diplomatic corps, there was a personnel file for a man named Ren Holt. It listed his rank as a attaché. It listed his years of service, his assignments, his retirement date. The commendations section was sparse. He had never been given a major award. He had never been the subject of a public address. The summary line in his service record described his contributions as consistent and detail-oriented, and listed his specialty as small delegation liaison work, which was not the kind of specialty that got you remembered in official histories. He had gone home after the Vorthan summit. He had continued working for another 20 years, the same way he had always worked, attending the meetings nobody else attended, asking the questions nobody else asked, taking notes that other people later used to do important things without always knowing where the notes had come from. He had retired to a small house in the north of his country where the mornings in autumn were cold and the light was low. He had kept carving things, birds, animals. A very good fish, which joined the one his father had made on the shelf. He died surrounded by wood shavings and the people who loved him, and nobody outside a small circle ever knew his name. And the universe, which is large enough and patient enough to notice things that individual lifetimes miss, had been quietly recording what he was worth for 100 years before anyone thought to write it down. On Vorthan Station, in a hall where an agreement was signed that would reshape the relationship between two civilizations for the next several centuries, A young dragonling held a worn wooden carving in both hands and turned it slowly toward the light, looking at it from every angle, trying to understand what kind of creature made things this way. She did not put it down for a long time.